You may know, but we've got Siri Chilazi, the gender expert and senior researcher at the Women in Public Policy program at Harvard's Kennedy School. And I'm so excited to hear about this book and hear what you found and discussed, and what you and Brigid will discuss tonight. So Brigid is a former colleague of mine at the Washington Post, and that's when you started also looking into and researching what you'll be talking about tonight a little bit.
Yeah.
You are director of the Better Life Lab at New America, and author of Overwork, Transforming the Daily Grind in Quest for a Better Life. And I'm so excited to have you both here and have this robust discussion tonight. So I'm going to let you two take it away.
Okay.
Thanks so
Cool.
much.
Thank
Thanks.
you. And then there's this on. Just the long press it on?
Yeah.
Okay. Oops. Did I do this right? Did I change it?
No, that's
Okay.
right.
Yeah, so thank you so much for that wonderful introduction and wonderful warm welcome. And it's just fabulous to be here in this beautiful, beautiful bookstore. It's exciting. And so, Siri, it's amazing. This is an amazing book. I think it's a must read for anybody who works. You know, what I really want to do though is start off with this whole question of fairness.
Mm-hmm.
You know, what is fair at work? And I think, you know, this is not an elephant in the room. The elephant is stomping all around the room, which is this notion that somehow having a diverse workforce or having diversity in leadership, that somehow that implies you're lowering the standards, or that it's not fair, that it's, you know, people are calling this a backlash or a reset. So let's talk about, you know, fairness, what is fair work, and what's happening now.
Yeah.
And you know, will it get us to fairer work with all of these executive orders and everything happening to sort of slash DEI programs everywhere?
I love that we're starting with this because I think this is exactly the conversation that we need to be having exactly right now. We started writing this book 2.5 years ago, and we already then decided that we weren't going to call it anything about diversity, equity, or inclusion. Why? Because we wanted to get at what is really the goal of all of those efforts to begin with, right? Why are we doing all this work to try to level the playing field? What's the vision? For us, the vision is a world in which every single individual gets to be judged as an individual on their own merit and has an equal chance of succeeding, gets in essence an equal or level playing field to play on. So a simple analogy, right? Think about the 100-meter dash, and you've got two sprinters who are about to embark on this dash. Is it fair that one of them needs to start 10 meters or 20 meters behind the other so that they have a longer race to run? Most of us would say, of course not, right? In order to accurately judge who's the fastest sprinter, they have to start at the same starting line, and then we'll see who winds up at the finish line first. Or if one of them is running on the track and we put the other runner in the mud next to the track and say, okay, go. Who's going to finish first? We would probably look at that and say, yeah, that's not fair either. So for us, fairness means that everyone really gets that equal shot to succeed to their fullest potential. In the real world, not all the sprinters are equally as fast. Not everybody wants to become the CEO. Not everybody wants to work 80 hours a week, right? And we need to honor those individual preferences. But at least everyone should be able to do their work to the best of their ability and get fairly rewarded for that. And this brings us to meritocracy and the relationship between meritocracy and fairness. I don't know about you, but I feel like meritocracy is a word that has recently sort of burst onto the scene, and everybody's talking about it right and left all of a sudden. I had to, in fact, go look up the definition of meritocracy just to make sure I know what I'm talking about. And the Merriam-Webster dictionary tells us that meritocracy is a system where people advance or are given power according to their demonstrated abilities. Right? Their merit. So then the question is that happening? And as a researcher, I can tell you definitively it's not. There's a mountain of evidence to suggest that today we are not running the race with everyone starting at the same starting line, but in fact, many people are starting way back. Let me give you just one example, and you know, if we have time, I can give you 1,000 more. There are more than 300 studies, so-called audit studies, where researchers send two versions of the exact same resume with just one little detail changed. So maybe one resume has a woman's name at the top, the other one has a man's. Or maybe one resume indicates indicates that the person is 35 years old, and the other one indicates through a college graduation date that they're 55 years old. Or maybe one resume mentions being involved in the PTA, which indicates that this person is a parent, and the other resume has no such mention. But otherwise, everything on these two resumes is exactly identical. Now, if we lived in a true meritocracy, where people advance according to their demonstrated skills, these two candidates should have exactly the same chance of getting invited to an interview or getting hired, because their demonstrated skills are exactly the same. But more than 300 studies show that that is actually not true. Men are systematically more likely to get opportunities than women, people without children to get more opportunities than people with children, middle-aged workers more likely to get opportunities than older workers, and so forth. So it's just a fact that we don't live in a meritocracy yet today. And while it remains a really worthwhile vision to strive for, the only way we'll get there is by being able to evaluate people fairly, being able to spot talent and nurture talent fairly, so that the best talent actually rises to the top.
I love that. And so one of the things that I really love about your book is that you're also really action oriented. You know, it's not just about raising awareness or educating, which is really important. And those studies that you mentioned, there's so many, there's such great research that's in here as well. But you talk about, so how we get there. So how do we do that? If work is not fair now, and if, you know, well, I guess maybe what let's start with, you know, the efforts then to make it fair have been, you know, what's now under attack, diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. You know, there is research, and, you know, I spoke with you recently for a piece that I wrote about this. Lots of research that in corporate America, at any rate, all of those diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts, you know, billions of dollars spent, and not a whole lot to show for it. Why is that?
Yeah. In short, it's because as much as we've had great intentions, we've been spending money and time and effort on the wrong things. Let's take just one example of diversity training and unconscious bias training. It's been incredible. It's been actually around since the 1960s, but it's really exploded in popularity in the last decade. We've been studying it since the 1960s, and there's no evidence to suggest that diversity training changes behavior. Yes, it can increase awareness in the short term. If you survey people after a training course, they'll say, oh my gosh, training was amazing. The facilitator was so inspiring. I learned a lot. I'm gonna go and tackle discrimination and bias in my work now. And then when we follow up 6 and 12 and 18 months later to see if people are making different decisions, if anything is changing, we just don't see evidence of that. So as much as we've been well-intentioned, we focused on the wrong solutions that haven't yielded results. And a common feature of a lot of these approaches, trainings, employee resource groups like women's networks, speaker events, networking sessions, is that they're programmatic, right? So it's that extra thing that you do on top of your everyday work. It's that extra line item on the budget over and above what's part of your core business. So of course, when there's political pressure, when there's a downturn in the market, economic headwinds, right? What's the first and easiest thing to get cut? It's the line item. When your real work overwhelms your calendar, what's the easiest thing to skip? It's the extra training. It's the extra networking session. So if we're gonna really make progress and see real results, to truly make work fair, we have to make the things that we're already doing fair. Hi, you're welcome. So that instead of doing extra things and starting new programs, we continue to do our everyday work, but just better. So if you're running meetings, how could you run them better? If you're hiring people, if you're giving feedback, how would you do that in a more objective way? How would you tweak your evaluation criteria so that you're able to actually spot the best talent? That's the systemic approach that works, has been proven to work.
So I want to get to that, but first let me ask you, you know, staying on with the DEI and the research, it was really interesting, and I've seen some of this, but you also talk about it in the book, that some of it has actually had backlash. Can you talk a little bit about that? That it's actually had the opposite effect to what the intention has been.
Yeah, and there's a lot of different flavors of that backlash. So one flavor is humans in general hate to be told what to do, and especially how to think. So when trainings are mandatory, there's evidence that sometimes people leave the training and behave in even more biased ways afterwards. Because they're kind of saying, nope, you're not going to tell me what to do. I'm going to have my own mind. The other flavor of backlash is the so-called moral licensing effect, which is that when you do something virtuous, you then feel like you have the license to go do something unvirtuous. I always like the analogy of like going to a workout class, going for a big run and saying, oof, I've earned myself a piece of cake. And now you've kind of undone all the good effects of your workout. So similarly, people who have gone through trainings or attended events or things like that, sometimes paradoxically, even unconsciously, then feel like they have license to actually make less fair decisions on an everyday basis. And then there's the unfortunate fact that, again, despite a lot of good intentions, many of the recent efforts came across as wanting to lift up certain groups, perhaps at the expense of others. So that DEI wasn't actually inclusive and for everybody. And I'm personally not surprised that that's generated some backlash, right? Because if we want to actually make the world fair and make work fair, it's everybody's job, and also everyone benefits, because we all want to be judged as individuals. We all want to have our, work and our skills evaluated fairly. We want to get rewarded fairly, so that if you did equal work, you don't get paid less than somebody else. So the benefits accrue to all of us, but the work also has to be done by all of us. And that's not how it's been up until now.
So let's talk about the work now. In real practical terms, you talked about running meetings differently. You talked about hiring differently. You know, how people review resumes, promotions, evaluations. Can you talk about some things that you found, that you write about in your book, that really do work, that really do make work fairer for everyone?
Yeah, I'll fly through a couple of examples real quick. You started off with meetings. A great study done at Novartis, a Swiss pharmaceutical company, global though, the company's goal was to increase employees' feelings of inclusion and psychological safety. So they looked at the one-on-one meetings that employees have with their managers. And they tested various different guidelines for managers on how to conduct these meetings. It turns out the most effective guideline was talk less, listen more, turn over control of this meeting to your employee and say, what do you need? What are your needs and aspirations? How can I help you? That led both to team members feeling more included, feeling more committed to the company, and actually it also increased the frequency of meetings. So it's a tiny tweak to something that's already happening in most organizations very often, one-on-one meetings. Let's talk about resumes. I'm sure almost everybody in the room has one. Most of yours is probably in the format where you list your past work experience with specific dates attached, right? So, management consultant, 2015 to 2020. Well, one of the things that this format does is it makes career gaps really obvious. So if you ever took time away from the workplace to care for children, to care for elderly family members, to go on a sabbatical, to work on a side hustle that didn't pan out, that you now kind of want to downplay, take care of your mental health, right? Any reason, you're going to have that gap that's now really obvious. And empirically, we have seen that employers tend to penalize applicants with career gaps. So in one study in the UK, looking at more than 9,000 firms, they made a small tweak. They listed the experience with a total amount of time. So management consultant, 5 years. Journalist, 10 years, right?
Longer than I.
A long time. You don't lose any information that's relevant to people's skills and their merit, right? All you do is you obscure the potential gaps. And what this study found is that it actually increased the likelihood of everybody, women and men, being called in for an interview and advancing in the hiring process. Because when companies were able to look past the career gaps and focus on the actual skills that people brought to the job, they were able to make better matches between open jobs and what they were looking for. One more real quick example on promotions. Most of us in our organizations, the way you get promoted is you have to ask for it, or your manager has to ask for it, right? So part of what the process is testing is willingness or ability to self-promote, to be aggressive, to be like self-advocating, which may or may not be a mark of success in most jobs, may or may not be an acquired skill for most jobs. So one solution that's been shown to level the playing field is moving from this kind of opt-in promotion system where you have to actively raise your hand to an opt-out system, where after a certain amount of time, all employees or relevant employees are automatically considered for promotion. So think about a lot of professional services firms, law, consulting, where people are typically an analyst for a couple of years, then maybe they get promoted to associate. You could just say, okay, after 2 years as an analyst, we're gonna review everybody for promotion. It doesn't mean that they'll get promoted, but we'll actually review everybody. And that would be an example of that opt-out scheme that has been shown to really level the playing field.
So interesting. One of the things that sort of a big theme in your book, a big theme in my recent book as well, is how so much in the work culture we tend to think of these as individual problems or individual issues, and they're really systems issues. And one of the things that you really talk about in your book is using behavioral science. Can you talk a little bit about that, using behavioral science and focusing on systems rather than sort of fixing the individual?
Yeah, that's sort of the underpinning insight of the whole book and of this whole field, which is we actually know so much about how human brains work, from psychology, neurobiology, sociology, all these other fields. We haven't hacked the human brain yet, don't get me wrong. I don't know if we ever will, but we know quite a bit. And one of the things we know is that our brains naturally process really large amounts of information every single second by resorting to mental shortcuts and heuristics and patterns. And that's actually what we call unconscious bias. There is no evidence to suggest that we can somehow take this bias out of human brains. Not at all. It's sort of built into how our brains work. So all these efforts to de-bias humans, to get our brains to fundamentally function differently, are almost doomed to fail. It's a lot of wasted effort. But what behavioral science has shown is that our environments, so physical environments, the processes and systems that surround us at work, what we think fellow humans believe, norms, the shared but often unspoken understandings of what's acceptable or expected in a given context. Those types of systemic factors shape our behavior to an immensely large degree that we don't even realize. Let me give you one quick example from the UK. Again, Santander Bank. They asked the men at this bank, how many of you support flexible work and would be willing to work flexibly yourself? What do you think? What proportion of the male employees at Santander were fans of flexibility? Anybody want to guess?
100%.
You're so close. 99%. Everyone. Now here's the real kicker. When then they were then asked, what percentage of other men, your peers working here, do you think are supportive? What do you think they said? You have a good track record of guessing.
I guess it was like 20.
65, it turns out. But there was still a big gap between what they themselves believed and what they thought other people believed. And when that gap was closed, so they ran an experiment where some of these men were informed, listen, actually, everybody agrees with you. Flexible work should be normalized and you should be doing it. Their intentions to take parental leave and work flexibly themselves increased dramatically. 13% at Santander and 50% at another UK bank. So it just goes to show you that we don't always behave fully in accordance with our beliefs and values, because our peers, our surrounding systems, what we think our bosses will think, what we think our organization values, those types of things really shape what we end up actually doing. So tweaking those, in other words, changing the system, not the individuals, is the most efficient way to get humans to behave differently.
I love that, the idea of choice architecture, right? Yeah.
Exactly.
So we're going to open it up for questions in just a bit, but I did want to ask you, you've mentioned a couple examples, but there's so many great examples in the book that I think are so hopeful.
Yeah.
You mentioned Google or BBC. I'm just wondering, can you tell us one or two stories, or maybe just one, and then we'll get to questions, of a company like Google, somebody that did something that was a sort of a systems change that really did make a difference, that getting closer to that fairer work for everyone that we're talking about.
Yeah. Let me share the story of Roz Atkins, a journalist at the BBC. And the reason I particularly love this story is because Roz Atkins is a journalist that doesn't work in HR. isn't a senior leader of the organization, is in no position of authority or power to compel anyone to do anything, but he manages to ignite a global movement nonetheless. So I think I'm going to give you the takeaway up front before I tell you the story. But the takeaway is all of us can do this. All of us can do something small in our own work that can have unbelievable ripple effects down the road. So Roz knew that his journalism would be more powerful if it was reflective of the world that it actually serves. But he realized that he had no data to know whether that was the case. At the time, he was the presenter of a 1 hour long nightly primetime news show. So think, Anderson Cooper or whoever on TV here in America. So he said, okay, we don't have the data, but we're gonna generate it. Let's start counting. With his production team, every night after the end of their show, they took 2 minutes and they said, who did we feature on screen during our 1 hour, and were they women or men? So they generated this data for a month and found out that only 39% of the people on screen on their program were women, which was a lot lower than what they thought. So they said, okay, we've got room to improve. Let's set ourselves a goal of getting to 50%. They got there within 4 months, and then they kept it up for years, for as long as the program was on air. So this is already a huge success story of one show and changing the face of journalism. But what's really remarkable is that Roz didn't stop there, but he then said, some of my fellow journalists might find this valuable too, because I know they, like me, care about high impact, high representative journalism, and I know they, like me, are super busy and overwhelmed. But we figured out a simple system to build this into what we already do, to make work fair. Not a new program, just do what you're already doing, but do it better. So he started sharing the approach with other programs, and long story short, eventually more than 750 content creating teams all around the BBC globally joined, as well as more than 150 external partner organizations. So this methodology is spread to other news organizations, journalism schools, and corporations. And the most remarkable thing, I think, is audiences have noticed. BBC, as I'm sure all news and media organizations, do regular surveys of their target market. And people noticed more diversity in the content, and people reported enjoying the content more when it became more representative.
I love that.
One person igniting a global movement.
Yeah, and I actually, a couple of years ago, I wrote a piece for the BBC, and that was actually one of the guidelines before I even started reporting.
Yeah.
We have a 50% rule, and I love that. Like, got it. So last question to you, and then we'll open it up for the audience. You talk about, a kind of a call to action. You were saying that we can all be change agents. Can you talk a little bit about, in your own life, how you have made some changes, either personally or professionally? What would you ask all of us to do as we go off to work tomorrow based on some of the stuff you've researched or your own experience?
Yeah. One anecdote that I share in the book is, in addition to being an academic researcher, I have a second career as a fitness instructor. And I often in my classes, I'd see the sea of women. So I'd say, oh, hello, ladies, welcome. And there was one time I was teaching class. I'd been saying, ladies, ladies, ladies all along in class. And I realized there were a couple of gentlemen sort of hiding and lurking in the back row. And I thought, oh my gosh. So I made a really concerted effort to change my speech patterns towards words that are more gender neutral, so that whoever is in the room, they can always feel like they belong. So folks, friends, everyone, beautiful people, fabulous rock stars, whatever it is. In fact, Lufthansa, the German-based airline, has done something similar. In all their announcements, they don't say ladies and gentlemen, they just say dear passengers. Because some passengers are kids, some may not identify as a lady or a gentleman, and there's really no harm in being a little bit more inclusive. It's so easy. It took me a little bit of focused practice for a couple months. I wrote down a list of gender neutral words for myself, but in a few months I changed my speech pattern. I'll give you another example that's not in the book. A couple of years ago I was giving a talk, and somebody approached to me after and said, can I give you some feedback? I said, oh, of course, please tell me. And she had noticed that as I was talking about studies and presenting data, whenever I mentioned the researcher by name or mentioned their institution, it was always what we would consider in the US context an elite institution, a Harvard, a Yale, or a Stanford. And now I was actually quoting research from researchers around the world at a variety of institutions, but unconsciously, I had probably gravitated towards lifting up the examples that are most similar to me and the colleagues that are closest to me. And I never spotted that, but this person did, and I'm extremely grateful for the feedback. So again, this is something measurable. This is something that's easy to fix. I went over my presentations and made sure that I'm featuring research from a variety of institutions, but also giving credit and shedding the light equally. So these don't have to be huge, big things. My call to action to all of us here tonight would be to think about what you're already doing on a daily basis, at work or at home, and pick one small tweak that you could make to something to make it more fair.
Oh, I love that. And with that, let's open it up for questions. Anybody?
It's always who's the brave person to ask the first question once the floodgates are open. Yeah.
So, given the current environment, how do you feel this is going to move forward? Right? Because like you talked about the BBC and the 50%, and I came up in public accounting, and we back in the 90s we actually tracked percent of women and minorities on our largest, biggest clients, and there was a push to increase those numbers. We were very quiet about it, but we wrote them down, and now like everyone feels you can't track all that, you can't write it down. How do we possibly move forward without? I guess it gets to that personal effort.
Yeah,
right?
it's a great question. It is the question. The book is called Data-Driven Design for Real Results. So data is central to this work. And so I'm very concerned, I will say, if we don't have the ability to collect data, report on it even internally or even to the relevant stakeholders, could you run a business without data? If you were developing a new product and trying to take it to market, could you be successful by saying, oh, let's just develop what we think is awesome, and let's not even have a deadline. Let's just release this product out whenever it's ready, and then when it's out on the market, let's just see how it does. Except, oh, wait a second, we can't correct sales data and we can't track profitability numbers, so I guess we'll just trust that people are loving this thing and we'll keep manufacturing more of it. We'd never ever run our businesses this way. In fact, one of the other core messages of the book is that in order to really achieve real results and move from a world of a lot of talk to a lot of measurable outcomes, is we have to approach it the same way we approach our core business, with the same seriousness, but also using the same tools, including data. I will say though, I think that in this moment, less talk is not necessarily a bad thing, because there's been a lot of talk in the last 5 years, and it wasn't always backed up by action, and it is not backed up by the real results. So I wouldn't be too sad if organizations stopped the flashy events and the big kind of budget announcements. Ooh, we're spending $100 billion in this and committing blah 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 millions to that, and just said, hey, we're just going to change how we run meetings. We're going to change how we hire. We're going to reevaluate our performance evaluation criteria. We're going to run a pay audit to make sure that there's no favoritism and that there's no undue gaps. And all of that can happen without any kind of public proclamation, without it having any separate line item in the budget, without it having any title of DEI. It's just you running your business in the smartest, most effective way. So I think that is the way forward, and I'm optimistic, I'm very hopeful that it can actually yield better results than the approaches that we've tried so far, as paradoxical as it sounds in this moment.
So you're actually hopeful.
I am hopeful. I'm a little bit concerned, but I'm very hopeful that if we maximize this moment, and if we use this moment for something good, right? Because out of the ashes can rise the phoenix. So if we can be the phoenix and take this to a better place, there's actually a lot of upside ahead of us.
I hope so. Okay. Other questions?
Other question.
I'll ask one. You mentioned I'm retired. My wife's retired. And you said how to improve things in the home.
Yeah.
I mean, it seems like we're always on a different wavelength. For example, I'm planning a trip to New Mexico and Phoenix to visit our son. But we put it on hold. So my wife tells me to put the books away. But then the other day I find them where we sit to eat, and I'm saying, "Oh, I put them back," and she said, "Well, I was hoping you would do something with with it." So I mean, I just didn't get it. I just didn't get it.
You know, this story gets at a deeper issue, which is well, actually probably many deep issues, and Brigid is a true expert in work and life, so I would love to hear your perspective on that. But ambiguity, which has been studied a lot, and it turns out the more ambiguity there is about who's going to do what and by when, and is this your responsibility or mine, and do you need to have 5 years of work experience or 7 years of work experience to be qualified for this position, and if you apply, can you negotiate your pay or not? You get my point. Ambiguity shows up in a lot of different contexts. It is problematic. Much research has shown that whenever we're able to reduce ambiguity and be more clear about expectations, standards, what are true requirements, it actually leads to less friction in the process and better outcomes for all.
Thank you.
So I leave it to you as to how to present that to your wife.
I'll have to make the change.
But it's a great question.
If I could just say one other thing. This is normal for me to always be around women. It doesn't matter if I'm in an elevator or where I am. I'm always seems to be in the minority. But I've always worked with a lot of women. And the personal trainer I have is a woman.
Yeah.
But I've always worked with women. You know, they've been the majority of the people that I've worked with. And they do a good. I don't want to sound condescending, but you know, they do a good.
Yeah.
They're very competent.
Equally as good as men.
They're very competent, and you know, so for me, it's kind of hard to understand why there is a problem. You know, and especially the firm that I worked at. I mean, the percentage had to be more than 50%. I mean, I used to work with Patrice.
Yeah.
I actually have a question.
Yeah.
So, what are your thoughts about the evaluation process? Because I work for a public accounting firm, actually, and we have a formal evaluation process, but I don't know. It's still very subjective to me. So, what are your thoughts on that?
Evaluation of humans in any context is one of the processes that is most rife, with bias. As a general rule, the more structure and formality we can introduce, the better. Whenever things are informal and when there's ambiguity, right, room for interpretation, room for subjectivity, that's where we see bias flourish. So a couple concrete things. One is humans are very bad at remembering. If you're asked to evaluate someone once a year, and you're supposed to really accurately first remember everything that they did over the last 12 months and really evaluate the value and the contribution of that, very difficult to do. So getting feedback more often along the way minimizes bias because people are just more likely to accurately remember what happened. Another strategy is asking these broad open-ended questions like comment on this person's performance. She's got something to say about this. I love it. Is much more likely to invite bias than asking more specific questions like what are this person's top 2 strengths that they will double down on? What is their one most critical development area, And then after that, asking for specific behavioral examples to back up all that feedback. I always like to imagine, if there was a video camera in this room, what could it capture versus what could it not? So if someone says, oh, she's just not ready to be promoted, the video camera doesn't capture that, right? She lacks executive presence. That's a very subjective assessment of something that the video camera could capture versus she interrupted someone and that was disruptive. She showed up late to the meeting and that disrupted the flow of the conversation, right? Those are concrete behavioral things that happened. Saying, oh, she's a sloppy human is a subjective assessment based on that concretely observed behavior. And I think way too much of our evaluation organizations today rest on those subjective assessments that are also really difficult for others to verify. Because if I didn't work with you, what someone tells me, oh, you just lack executive presence, there's no data that I can look at to assess whether that's actually the case. And it then goes back to accountability too in conversations, for example, right? We all write these evaluations, but then the big important people gather around a table in the room to make the ultimate decisions about who gets the opportunity, who gets promoted, who gets tapped. One strategy that some companies have tried is having a norm champion in the room, or a devil's advocate, or a fairness officer in the room who's listening into the conversation. And when two candidates are treated differently, they're talked about differently, you know? Or when gendered language or stereotypical assessments are being made, they flag and say, hey, wait a second, we didn't say that about Bob 5 minutes ago. Why are we now saying that about Jenna right now? So there has to be some way to enforce that accountability. Tech can do that, play that role too, by the way. There's software that will flag like gendered words. Yeah.
Yeah, I actually was curious about your take on this, because I think a lot of times when we're talking about AI, there's a lot of focus on it is scaling a lot of our dark natural biases, right?
Yeah.
At the same time, particularly with transparency, explainability, things like that, there's potential opportunities for, I think, a lot more real-time behavioral, personalized feedback data, ongoing, pattern recognition. And one of the things that I'm really curious about your perspective on is, I don't know, have you read Painted Wolves by chance? No. Okay. Anyways, it's a book on leadership, but through the lens of studying women, because most of our leadership models and our evidence about what good leadership looks like actually come from male dominant samples.
Yep.
And so it's an interesting thing to think through, is like, if we start to have massive amounts of data, AI generated or otherwise, on like the entire workforce, and you kind of almost like start without criteria, like what might result, you know, in terms of fairness and outcomes. So anyways, I'd just love to hear your thoughts on like overall the data-driven paradigms, how AI fits in, technology.
I love that question. That's such an interesting question, is what if we went bottom up instead of top down, to kind of generate what this good leadership look like. I think it's incredibly difficult because we know that the road to leadership is not equal today. So we can't look at the people in power today knowing that many other people didn't get there because of tons of barriers put in their way, and then kind of infer what the desired qualities are. In fact, this is a problem with a lot of the selection algorithms that are in use in hiring today, is they look at the employees that are in-house now and assume that they're the best employees and say, well, what do they do? What are they like? Let's screen for those qualities to try to replicate more of those employees. But what you miss is the data on all the other people that you evaluated, who were part of the recruitment process, right? But who didn't get hired, who didn't make it through, who could have been even better. And so you're operating off of a biased sample. I will say that the promise with software in general, and even AI, is that it's an algorithm, so you can fix one thing instead of fixing hundreds or thousands or millions of biased minds. But then on the flip side, if you've got a biased technology, it can also wreak much more havoc precisely because of its larger scale.
Do you have any thoughts on things like social network analysis, though, where you might be able to look at, informal leadership structures, for example?
Yeah, super important. I'm a fan of, I think we're only at the beginning of our sort of creativity and understanding of what data looks like, right? So most people, when they think data, especially related to fairness, it's like, oh, how much do we pay people? Like, who have we hired? When did they get promoted? What's their tenure? These kinds of basic demographics, that's really great. Sentiment data, employee satisfaction surveys, yes, that's kind of around now, but I think it can afford to get a lot more sophisticated. Network analysis, looking at who's talking to whom, who's emailing whom. There's a company based in Cambridge, Massachusetts called Humanize that did a few research studies with these wearable sensors. It looked like an access card, but it was a sensor that tracked your movements throughout the office, tracked your speaking time, who you were speaking to, and they were able to do some fascinating analyses, mapping all of those dynamics. I can only imagine what else we'll be able to do with technology 5 or 10 years from now. But point is, we are going to be able to have so much more data at our fingertips. We'll have to use it wisely. Because even today, companies have a lot more data, even that basic demographic employment data, they have a lot more of it at their fingertips than they realize. I'll give you one example. I was working with the Nordic division of a global consulting firm, and they of course know exactly which consultants are working on which project, so that data exists in their systems. They'd never thought to slice and dice it by things like gender, tenure, the size of the account, the monetary value of the opportunity, the potential sales opportunity that people were working on, or the size of the project, to see if there were any differences. But all that data existed. And then once they started slicing and dicing, they in fact found a pattern that women tended to be staffed on smaller projects and sort of the less prestigious, less monetary value projects, as well as the pitches leading to those projects. So you have to find that pattern first. You have to do the diagnosis first before you can prescribe the medicine that is most likely to work. And then, just like doctors who schedule follow-up visits, you have to keep measuring to see if the medicine has the intended effect. Because sometimes it doesn't, and there's a lot of great examples, well, not great, but I would say sad or instructive or important examples of that too, where really well-intentioned interventions backfired spectacularly.
You know, if I could jump in, you know, we're talking about intention, and I'm thinking about some of the questions that you all have asked. You know, and with all of these different executive orders that have come out recently, I mean, going all the way back to the Johnson era, you know, commitments to affirmative action, commitments to equal opportunity. You know, it's not just DEI that's gone, and it's not just DEI that the Trump administration is going after in the corporate world, but all of the sort of the guardrails or the guidelines that created the impetus for people to track that data in the first place, those are gone now. And so that's what I'm wondering is, will the intention still be there that this is something that's important? You talk a little bit in the book about, you know, sick of the business case, don't make the business case, you know, but that there's a fairness case to be made. Yeah. And I guess that's what I'm wondering in this era as we're talking about intention. How do we ensure that the intention to be fair still lives on?
Yeah. Interestingly, I'm a little bit less concerned about that, because fairness has been shown in studies around the world to be a really universal and fundamental human value. I'll share with you one of my favorite studies that really exemplifies this, which looked at 4 and 5-year-old kids in the US. And these kids were given an odd number of marshmallows to distribute between 2 peers, 2 fellow kids who had cleaned their rooms. And these kids in the experiment were told, you know, A and B cleaned their rooms and they did an equally good job. So these kids, what did they do? They threw out 1 marshmallow, put it in the trash, so that they could give an equal number of marshmallows to these 2 other kids. Because equal pay for equal work. Now, when they were told, you know, A did a really sloppy job, but B did a really diligent job cleaning their room, then they had no trouble giving more marshmallows to B, because if they worked harder, if they did a better job, well, it's only fair that they should get rewarded for that. So just one example to suggest to you and to show to you that fundamental kind of understanding of what fairness is and the value and the importance of fairness, I believe is really broadly shared. But then it comes to, how do we frame it, right? Do we talk about it as a quest for us all to make us collectively better? Or do we inadvertently create some of these antagonistic dynamics? So I do think, and by the way, anecdotally, as I've been sharing, as we've been sharing the book On the Road this last month, my sense is that the number of people who care has not changed. And the intensity with which they care about fairness at work or in the world has not changed. What has changed is people's risk tolerance, for understandable reasons, in people's willingness to use their institutional position to make public statements or public acts around this. Again, for understandable reasons, because the landscape is shifting, the political landscape and the legal landscape, and so people don't want to take unnecessary risk. But to me, if there was a little bit less talk, like we said earlier, and more action, just behind the scenes, quietly, just going about your daily business, getting it done, it really wouldn't be a bad thing. Tom, I think you had a question earlier.
I did. I want to go back to the AI conversation and maybe pull a couple of things together. You talked about bias and how we naturally fill in the ambiguity so that we can make a quicker decision. And in many ways, the promise of AI is to help us make a quicker decision. Hey, we're gonna get this algorithm that we don't understand, but it's gonna give us an output, and it keeps me from having to think,
Yeah.
and so I can make a faster decision. And I'm just struck by, and I work in an organization that has a strong bias for action. I work in the military. And so I think about fairness, and I think about the confluence of those three factors, the personal, the technology, and the organizational culture. And I think, man, I really just want to slow down and try to make a better decision, and one that does incorporate more stakeholder perspectives and interests. What advice do you have for us on ways to slow down and perhaps just ask better questions so that we can get people to interrupt their urge to act?
Yeah. Really great question. And actually, that prescription of slowing down is exactly the best prescription for the analog world of just pure human brains. Is we're most likely to act based on our biases when we need to make decisions quickly, when we're stressed, when we're distracted, when we're overwhelmed. That's when we resort to all of those unconscious patterns. And often if we pause and allow our more sort of conscious and deliberate mind to take over, that's when we can overcome those instincts. So the question is, how might we build this in as part of our process? For whatever reason, the first example that came to my mind is from hiring. A lot of recruiters are incentivized based on time to fill a role. So when a role opens up, the quicker you can get a butt in the seat, like the better for you as the recruiter, and the company thinks the better for them. Except not. Because hiring the wrong people is really costly. Turnover is really costly when they leave 6 months later and you have to find someone new again. That's really costly. It's also very costly for relationships and emotions and psychology. If you hire a person that's not great at the job, a good fit for the team, they're going to cause a lot of interpersonal havoc. So that could be an example of an organizational process that can be tweaked, where we say, of course, we do care about time to fill role, but we also care about how these people perform once they're actually hired. So let's factor in their 6-month and their 12-month performance review into how recruiters are incentivized. We also care about whether they stay, right? Because we don't want all this turnover. So let's see if they're still around 6 months or 12 months or 2 years later, and that's also going to factor in. So those are just all design choices that we've made about what kinds of behaviors we choose to value and incentivize. And any design choice can be made again and can be made differently. And just like we saw with the resume example, I think this is another really sort of profound thing for me personally, is almost no process design is neutral. So just because something is a certain way today doesn't mean it's the only way, doesn't mean it's the best way, and doesn't mean that it's fair or that it actually treats everybody the same. In fact, most of the processes that we have today are remnants of a time when the workforce looked very different, because most people were, on some level at least, literally excluded from the workforce. I mean, job advertisements saying men preferred or men only, they were legal into the 1970s in this country. So it's only in the last half century that women have even on paper, let alone in practice, full access to all these things. So that's that. I also want to comment briefly on the AI piece, because I want to, as a scientist, this is my bias, I want to reinforce the importance of testing and experimentation. That's one of my, as much as there's promise with these technological systems, most of them on the market today are black boxes to clients, to consumers, to regulators, and to researchers. Companies will just say, trust us, we tested it, the algorithm is sound, we validated it, it's great, it's good to go. There's no verify, there's just the trust. And that's a real problem. So while I'm absolutely not an AI expert, I do believe that we should have expectations that companies that produce these tools, this software, that it's incumbent upon them to prove that it's fair and that it's unbiased, instead of unleashing it into the world first, and then when a lot of damage has been done years later saying, oops, sorry, we have to take it back. This is why medicines are tested in randomized controlled trials. They weren't always. There were some really devastating cases of drugs that made it into the market into the 1950s and 60s in the United States that caused horrific birth defects in children, for example, after which the government said, wait a second, we can't afford these kinds of mistakes. We don't just put a drug out on the market and then see what works and what doesn't. We go through rigorous multi-phase testing first to ensure the safety and the efficacy. We compare a new drug against a placebo, kind of a neutral control, and or the best currently available drug on the market to make sure that the new one actually provides some added value. And only after we've proven, the pharma company has proven all of that and has convinced us that it's as good to go, will we bring this drug onto the market. So I think we should apply the exact same process to technology, software, AI. Other question?
Any other questions?
All right.
Fascinating. That was
Yes.
wonderful. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you. Thank you so much for coming, and a huge thanks to Brigid for sharing the stage with me. This has been such an incredible conversation. Brigid's latest book is called Overwork, and it's so insightful and truly, I call it game changing because these conversations about how, overwork is too prevalent, Americans are so attached to their work compared to Europeans, things have to change culturally. These conversations have been going on for a long time, and you bring a totally different perspective and a solution, like just incisive analysis and solutions that have not been out there before. So thank you for your monumental contribution.
Yeah, well, it's all about fair work and equal opportunity and living good lives
Exactly.
for all people, not just a handful of
Yep.
rarefied billionaires.
Exactly.